Here we go. So welcome everyone to our Responding to Disclosures of Sexual Violence workshop, How to Mitigate Harm and Maximize Support. This workshop is being offered by Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis as part of Sexual Assault Prevention Month. My name is Jensen. I use she and they pronouns, and I work as the public educator over at Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis. And I'll turn it to Krystal, my co-facilitator, to introduce themselves.
Yeah, so as Jensen mentioned, my name is Krystal and I'm a sexual assault counselor at Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis. My pronouns are they, them.
I'll turn it to you, Krystal, to kick us off.
Yeah. So before we get started, I want to start with, before we get in too deep, I want to start with just a land acknowledgement of the place where we live and work and play. I think it's really important to honor the fact that these issues that we're talking about in terms of sexual violence disproportionately affect Indigenous communities, and there is a long-standing history of resiliency and strength to handle that disproportionate effect of sexual violence on missing and murdered Indigenous women and communities. So we acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We're part of the 1792 Between the Lakes Treaty and Treaty Number 3. And some parts of Guelph-Wellington, depending on where you're coming from, might touch on the Haldeman treaties as well, which negotiated 6 kilometers of land extending from the mouth of the Grand River to the base of the Grand River for the Mohawk and Neutral and Anishinaabe people. Today, there's only 5% of that land that's actually dedicated to Indigenous populations. And so I want to really, we are privileged to join and have this conversation and this dialogue on these lands. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the people who've gone before us and have been in many ways erased.
And I just wanted to highlight too our 24-hour crisis line, which is available for folks to call during, after, or any time that they feel. And that can provide, immediate emotional support. And it can also provide access and information to our programs and services at Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis. So just so you folks know, that is available to you. And it's also available on our website if you wanted to have a look there as well, or get some more information about our programs and services. But who are we at Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis? I'll give a pretty brief overview, but in a nutshell, we are a feminist, community-based, not-for-profit organization providing free and confidential, trauma-informed, and survivor-centric programs and services to survivors of gender-based violence in the community of Guelph-Wellington, including sexual violence, domestic violence, and human trafficking. In terms of where we're located, our administrative office is located in Guelph, which houses our sexual assault center, our transitional and housing support program, our family court support program, the anti-human trafficking program, public education and administration. We have Marianne's Place, which is our emergency shelter, which also houses our 24-hour crisis line. And we serve Wellington County through our Rural Women's Support Program, which has offices in Erin, Fergus, Mount Forest, and Palmerston. Being conscious of time, I will suggest if folks want more information about our programs and services, you can definitely reach out to us after or have a look at our website for more information about who we are and what we do. So why are we here tonight? Why did we want to deliver this training, and what do we hope you folks will get out of it? This training is specifically around how to respond to survivors of sexual violence, but the skills that you're learning could be helpful for other disclosures of gender-based violence, but just a note that this one is specifically about sexual violence as part of Sexual Violence Prevention Month. And why we feel that this work is important is that everyone can be involved in supporting survivors and in ending sexual violence. And more often than not, survivors will disclose experiences with sexual violence to those closest to them, such as friends, family members, coworkers, prior to, if at all, ever seeking formal support, such as through Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis or other community services. And so there are many individuals who in your lives may experience sexual violence. And so having those skills and tools to be able to provide a supportive and empathetic and effective response can really go a long way in a survivor's journey. And we believe that those skills are beneficial to everyone in the community. And really what we hope to you get out of this evening is recognizing that you don't have to be an expert to provide support, and to give you the confidence to be able to play a supportive and impactful role in a survivor's journey, should you receive a disclosure. And we're also coming at this through a harm reduction lens to give you the tools and skills to be able to, in supporting survivors, how can you maximize the support and minimize the harm that's caused from a disclosure.
Yeah. So we're gonna, oh, sorry.
No, that's all good. Krystal, did you want to talk about this quote for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So trauma happened and harms us, but I often wonder if the worst trauma is in the second wave, when your story is misbelieved, mistrusted, and malaligned. May your story find safe harbor in the presence of people who will honor both your vulnerability and your resistance. And that's a quote by KJ Ramsey. And we're going to unpack kind of in what ways that people experience trauma and then the residual effects of different reactions and how that impacts people as we go through this presentation. And so we're going to start with just kind of setting some of the context with what are disclosures and like why would somebody trust us with that information. So when we're talking about disclosure within this presentation, we're talking about disclosures as conversations where one individual would tell at least one other person about their experience of sexual violence. And so when there can be lots of different ways that disclosure is used in different things, when we're referencing it in this presentation, we're referring to the moment when someone is brave enough to kind of let somebody else in to share or see a painful experience. And so what can you take away from a disclosure? And really, as a sexual assault counselor, I probably think about this way more often than I need to, but when someone opens up to tell you what their story is, that's really, it's like they're offering you a gift. And so if your reaction is a refusal of that gift or is more questioning, it's possible that there's, someone just wanted to trust you and offer that out. And so this is a great opportunity for you to prove that you're a listening ear, that you're supporting. And if you have connections to resources in the community, that could be helpful. And sometimes people want that, and some people just want a listening ear, and there is no right way for someone to respond. And we're gonna, again, touch on some of those things as we go through this presentation.
So why would someone choose to disclose? There are many reasons behind that, all unique to an individual. These are some examples. So individuals may be seeking assistance. They may be seeking advice, maybe connections to services, or it could just be emotional support. They may be unsure of what to do next. And part of that may be sharing to reduce the burden of the violence into part of their healing through trauma journey. Disclosing may be the first step in that. They might also, for individuals who may be, working with individuals who they've experienced sexual violence from or living or have a close relationship to, they may be disclosing in order to protect themselves or protect others from future violence. An activist piece to disclosures is to raise awareness in the community. And we saw this a lot with the Me Too movement of individuals sharing and disclosing their experiences and having that camaraderie with other survivors and raising awareness about a broader movement that unfortunately sexual violence is much more prevalent than a lot of folks have realized. So we do see that there's a lot of power in that as well. And for individuals who are reporting through law enforcement or through the criminal justice system, that disclosure may be a piece in achieving justice or seeing accountability. And just before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to pose a poll to you folks. So let me just open that up here. So I'm wondering if you folks feel comfortable answering, what are some of your biggest fears when it comes to potentially receiving a disclosure of sexual violence? And you can pick any of the few. So if you see that coming up on your screen there, you can feel free to cast your vote for what is one of your biggest fears when it comes to potentially receiving a disclosure of sexual violence. Give folks a couple minutes there.
Yeah, and your answers are anonymous. So we'll see how many people selected each one, but we won't see who indicated what.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much for your responses. I'm just going to show you folks how folks responded. So saying the wrong thing, not being able to provide enough support are pretty much equal. Freezing and not knowing how to react, and not feeling qualified to help. And some folks had said other. So thank you so much for all of your answers. And we're hoping that as we go through this evening, we'll be able to let you folks know that how to avoid, a negative response, how to avoid saying the wrong thing, and how to be able to provide that support and get over our feels of not feeling competent or qualified to provide that support. So we hope that we'll be able to address some of those concerns throughout this evening, and thanks very much for participating in that. All right, so just for as many reasons as there are why someone may choose to disclose, there are also many reasons why individuals don't. And I will preface too that say the majority of individuals who experience sexual violence never tell anyone about it. Sexual violence, and particularly sexual assault, is one of the most underreported crimes in Canada. And individuals may never share that for a multitude of reasons. And there are many myths and misconceptions that exist out there around survivors, a lot of which we're going to unpack this evening. But these create real or perceived consequences for coming forward. And those consequences can be tangible, it can be fearing a job loss, it can be fearing future violence. They can be emotional, feeling blamed, feeling re-traumatized, internalizing that shame and made to feel at fault. And for many, not feeling as if our experiences are valid enough. And this comes from the way in which we've understood or misunderstood what is sexual violence, and recognizing, if it's not violent, if it's not happening by a stranger in a dark place, we may not see that as being valid because that's how the media and broader society has categorized what is sexual violence. So those are just some of the reasons, and we're going to unpack a lot of that this evening. But I'm grateful that all of you are here.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we mentioned, but if you have questions at any point, please feel free to use the chat box or otherwise indicate. There will be a question period at the end, but also feel free as we're going along if you want us to stop and clarify or stop and give more examples, we're happy to do that. And so in order to talk about the ways that we can support people, we need to have a little bit of understanding of kind of what are some of the ways that this can go wrong or can go in a way that is potentially harmful. And victim blame, what we call victim blaming, which is, as it sounds, blaming the person who harm was perpetrated against. And there's also secondary wounding. So that's wounding that's outside of the initial traumatic event or the initial experience of sexual violence, and is often occurs within a wider community. So I like to think of it this way. So if your primary experience of abuse can be any combination of these feelings, and I'm sure there are a million more that aren't represented here. But these are kind of some of the things that will come up during an incident of sexual violence. And that is the primary trauma. That's what somebody carries around with them and their lived experience. Where secondary harming comes in is at this secondary level and the systemic level. And this is where our societal beliefs, our misunderstandings, our misinformation, that this is where we're going to face all of that, unfortunately. And so this is where, you might have somebody say, well, what were you wearing? or why didn't you fight harder? And that can come from friends, family, medical professional, legal professionals, support workers, community workers, like literally just about anywhere, because the myths around and the misinformation around sexual violence is so pervasive. Unfortunately, that makes the idea or the experience of secondary wounding that much more likely. So what is secondary wounding? It occurs when a response to a disclosure of sexual violence blames, shames, or in any way harms the individual who disclosed. And so there's a graphic we will go over in just a few short slides that visually depicts this, but there is a ripple effect. We know that trauma is an experience that overwhelms our senses and our ability to cope. And so if we're trusting someone with that moment of complete overwhelm and we're willing to share that story, we're all the more vulnerable for shame, blame, and internalizing those messages, which just leads to further harm.
And so victim blaming, very closely related to secondary wounding, is placing the responsibility for sexual violence on those who experience it. So Krystal mentioned some of, what does that sound like? What does that look like? And that can look like they were asking for it. Why didn't they fight back? They should never have XYZ. And so what does this lead to? It has such broad reaching impacts. We've mentioned survivors blaming themselves and internalizing that blame for the sexual violence that they've experienced. For society, it leads to broader society and individuals believing that what it means to prevent sexual violence is looking at the individuals, and that individuals have the power to prevent their own assaults had they just made smarter choices of what to wear, not drinking, not going out with strangers. And it even leads to individuals internalizing that behavior. And we see this with messaging of, don't walk home alone, or text me when you get home, or hold your keys in your hands. Today, when I was scrolling through social media, I even saw someone selling harm reduction keychains. And it was like all these different tools to have on your keys that could help you in an incident where you might be being assaulted. And part of that just made me really sad to think about. It's so normalized that we believe this way, and that believing that being hyper vigilant and aware and cautious of our behaviors will be the key in preventing sexual violence. And we see, the rhetoric a lot that we need to teach about consent, about healthy relationships, rather than teaching, here's how to avoid getting assaulted. And so throughout this workshop, we want to steer you away from engaging in victim blaming and secondary wounding, and to engage in meaningful, non-judgmental support.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go through some different examples of some ways that secondary wounding and victim blaming is materialized through our words, through our actions, and then give you the skills and tools to be able to combat that, whether you hear it from a survivor themselves who's internalizing some of these secondary wounding, or from the greater society at large. So one of the types that we see is blaming the individual for being targeted, for putting themselves in that position. And this is the kind of they've asked for it piece. Asking and hearing questions such as, how did you get yourself into that situation? What did you expect dressing like that or going there alone? And could you not see how dangerous that situation could be? And so really what this is poking holes.
One sec.
Sorry. Just gonna, oh, perfect. And so what this leads to is really poking holes in a judgment of another person, that you should have known better. And therefore, by not assessing the risk of a situation, they have brought it upon themselves. Just next slide, please. But really to shift this perspective, to shift this idea that individuals have asked for it, we really need to push home the message that no one wants to be sexually assaulted and no one chooses that situation. And by monitoring or altering our behaviors, this will not prevent sexual violence, because the only people who are responsible for sexual violence are those who perpetuate it. So that behavior change is necessary for the broader society, to realize around consent, the importance of consent, and consent as a feature of healthy relationships. That is that type of behavior that needs to be changed, not on that individual level.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it is important to really draw attention to the fact that like many of us have grown up being taught no means no, like like that. And when we think of that perspective, no one is choosing. If they've said no in any way, that person stopped choosing. And this is power exerted over somebody, not not someone's choice to put themselves in that situation. And so as Jensen so eloquently mentioned, like there's no one is choosing it. And it does, when we ask questions around, well, how did you put yourself in that situation? We really are taking the lens away from the person who caused harm, and we're putting the lens onto the person who was harmed by another person. And so just trying to collectively shift our attention so that we're focused less on the individual who's been harmed and more on what are the parameters or what are the things that are allowing society to perpetuate these beliefs.
Mhm. And so, in terms of how we can provide a response that shifts away from that and those positive words of affirmation that could be used in a supportive response, something even as simple as just saying it's not your fault can be so incredibly powerful for someone to hear, particularly if you hear them regurgitating some of this internalized blame. And mentioning that, like, there should be nothing inherently dangerous about a normal situation. So mentioning that, you did nothing to bring this upon yourself, and you did not create the situation that you were in. So just reaffirming for an individual who comes forward that it's not their fault, and that there is nothing they could have done to prevent that situation. Particularly, engaging in consent is a multiple person conversation, and it shouldn't be up to just one person as well.
Yeah. Excuse me. And so there's also reactions that we that shift the attention to kind of people's reactions in the moment of the sexual assault or sexual violence. And so you'll get questions like, why didn't you fight back, scream, or run away? And did you even say no? Um, these kinds of questions again perpetuate what Jensen was talking about around focusing on that victim and really blaming that individual for something that was outside of their control. And so how do we shift that? There we go. Well, and we know that most sexual violence survivors don't actually fight back the way it's portrayed in movies. Movies and media, which is a big form of information for many, many people, are often, those scripts are written by people who don't necessarily have lived experience of what sexual violence looks like. And so to expect that someone is going to scream and have visible markings all over themselves, and yes, that does happen, and that is not the only form that sexual violence can take. It's also very normal for our brain to be completely overwhelmed in that moment, and for us to freeze and shut down. And so we don't want to fight back because we don't want to make it worse. And fundamentally, we need to rethink what resistance looks like. Again, because we've been so informed by people who don't necessarily have the lived experience to be speaking to that environment or that experience, we all have this to a certain extent, where we've all been misinformed. And so how can we shift that? you did what you had to do to survive in the moment. Whether your body was overwhelmed and you froze, or you don't remember all the details, or what have you, it's normal to freeze. It's normal to resistance can look like many, many, many different things. When there's a power imbalance in place, people will do an automatic cost benefit analysis of what is the safest way for me to get through this experience. And so people will do just about anything. And it can look like, some people carry a lot of guilt because they feel like they gave in to the sexual violence. When really, when you unpack their story and you look at all the factors that were moving, they said no a multitude of times. They did what they needed to do, and there was still not a lot of options. And so just do what you have to do to get through it. And normalizing that resistance looks like many, many different things, and that anyone who's made it out to the other side of an experience of sexual violence, they did something to resist what was happening to them.
And there's also the type of blaming that blames the person for the reactions after the sexual violence as well. And what this really is looking like is that there's, in our brains and the way that we've structured it, is that there's a right and a wrong way to experience sexual violence, and that there's a right and a wrong way to process trauma. And we see this coming out a lot for individuals' reactions before, during, and after sexual violence. But for those reactions after sexual violence that are often judged is, if they assaulted you, why did you let them spend the night? Or why are you still in contact with them? Why are you still dating them? Why didn't you tell anyone about it? And so, as I mentioned, it's really creating this narrative that in your head, you have an idea of how we would expect maybe someone to behave after trauma, what we would have done. And it's really easy to think that and get into that place. The next slide, please. Perfect. But really, to counter that, it's recognizing that, and what it means to be trauma informed is to recognize that everyone's experiences with trauma are different. Everyone's experiences with sexual violence will be different. And so their needs before, during, after will all be unique to that individual. And how a survivor behaves before, during, or after their experiences of sexual violence does not make their experiences any less valid. And that's why it's really important too, with that thinking of, well, you should just report, or like, let's go, I'll help you do it right now. Recognizing that it's important to not force a survivor or shift them in any way to react or respond in a way that fits with what we think they should do, whether that's reporting or seeking counseling. So being able to, provide options of, the type of support that's available, and just asking, what support or what would be helpful for you right now, and taking their lead is really important.
One of the key questions and little catchphrases that I often think about is trauma informed means to switch the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And it takes that zoomed out lens. Instead of zooming into the individual who's standing in front of us, who's acting out of the ordinary or in some way that makes us concerned, rather than trying to identify what those symptoms are and define that wrongness, looking at what happened, what was the overall arching story that was going on at the time that you experienced something challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And so another big type of secondary wounding that can happen during disclosures or while we're supporting folks who have experienced sexual violence is a minimization. Again, because we've been misinformed and we have these kind of extreme versions of what sexual violence looks like, we don't always take into consideration the level of violation that someone experiences, and they might not have any visible marking to show the level of violation. That does not discredit the violation that took place. So things you could hear are like, you're overreacting, I'm sure you were misunderstanding. Or, they're such a nice person, they would never do that. Are you sure you don't regret it? So ways that we can counter that are to be aware of the myths and misconceptions that exist, to know about stereotypes, to have an awareness on the fact that we have been misinformed largely as a society. And so what are the myths that are out there, those common misconceptions? When when in doubt, avoid comparing, period. Full stop. There is no way to compare the impact of sexual violence. People's ability to process trauma depends so much on their life story, on their life experiences, on the way that they walk through the world, that they're, what might seem minor to one person could be completely overwhelming to another because of the sheer level of other things going on in their world. And so avoiding comparison is always a good rule of thumb. Normalizing that there is no right or wrong way to experience or process sexual violence. As there's lots of resources online, and I think, and I can share some in the chat as well about what the various types of sexual violence that exist out in the world, everything from harassment to much more violent, physically violent experiences. But understanding that that's a spectrum of experience, and really normalizing that it's okay if someone feels violated, it's okay for them to share that with someone else. And celebrate growth, healing, and resilience. I would add in resistance. Really try to hold as much hope and optimism around what they did well to get through what could have been a much worse situation. That's very often one of, and we know as a result of trauma, one of the biggest areas that's impacted is our sense of self, our ability to tune in with ourselves, to have an idea, a level of good confidence, and all of those things are associated to directly, those all come into question after a traumatic event. And so having someone on the outside who's really cheering a survivor on and really genuinely acknowledging what their strengths are and the ways that they can continue to grow and heal is usually a welcomed strategy.
And the last type of secondary wounding that we want to discuss is negative labeling. And this is really comments that speak to that survivors may have ulterior motives for coming forward, or that people with certain lived experiences and identities are more deserving of sexual violence. Such as we hear, well, they have sex with people all the time, or how many sexual partners have you had? They're definitely just trying to get revenge or attention, or we're always high, they're always out drinking. It's no wonder this happened. Next slide, thank you. But really is that recognizing that anyone can experience sexual violence, regardless of their sexual history, regardless of their social location, and no one deserves sexual violence based on their lived experiences. And I think that we see the discounting of people's lives in lots of different aspects other than survivorship as well. And it's important to recognize that the false reports for sexual violence are very minimal, and these are comparable to false reports for other crimes. So if you are hearing that type of rhetoric of, oh, they're just doing this for attention, they're doing this because they regret it, really noticing in that moment, and this is what we say all the time, is to believe survivors. Take them for their word for it, and don't assume that they're wrong until proven right. I know the legal system would be hearing this being like, that's not right, but that's the way that we work here, and I think that's a good way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. We also know that people cope with extreme stress in a variety of different ways, and and have a variety of different coping skills that have been normalized for them. And so what you're seeing in terms of, if you're seeing someone who is sleeping around a lot after they've been assaulted, or they're still getting drunk after they've been assaulted, those very well could be how they're getting through and how they're coping. And so it's really an opportunity for us to check ourselves and really examine what's actually going on, and what's coming up within me that's making this hard for me to believe, and addressing that for ourselves rather than putting that labor onto the survivor to explain or to justify themselves. This is me, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you. So what are the impacts of victim blaming and secondary wounding? There's a variety of ways that this can impact people. It often prevents people from coming forward at all because they don't want to have to deal with people misbelieving them or not believing them. There can be a re-traumatization if you felt a lot of shame in the incident of sexual violence, and that feeling is perpetuated by someone who responds by blaming you in some way, asking why you were where you were, really re-traumatize an individual. We know that the justice system hasn't done a fantastic job at responding to reports around sexual violence, and the lack of accountability for perpetrators is common knowledge on some levels, but it's actually only 1 in 5 sexual assault cases are dismissed as being unfounded. So 4 out of those 5 cases that go forward are based in facts and based in like legal facts. But understanding that healing isn't always attached to accountability for perpetrators. There are many ways for survivors to continue on their healing journey without the justice system, and or using the justice system as they feel ready and feel like that's their choice of how they want to respond. And so this is kind of a graphic, I think, visually, generally speaking. And so this kind of flowchart stuff works great for me. So what we're talking about is there's an incident of sexual violence that occurs for someone. And the direct impact of that is that the understanding of ourselves and of the world is shifted in one way or another. And often it comes with a feeling of a loss of control. That the things they knew about themselves don't seem as true anymore, and the way they understood the world doesn't seem like it aligns anymore. And so then somebody discloses and gets up the courage to say something out loud, but gets a negative response. And what happens is often feelings of self-blame, the loss of control are confirmed or intensified. Because now what I feared true, that somehow I did something to bring this on myself, somebody outside of me is now confirming that for me. And so then my shame and my guilt and loss of control just all intensifies, which often results in increased isolation and silencing. Why would I tell a second person? The first person didn't believe me, and look where I'm at now. And so why on earth would I do that again? And so that the initial kind of survival mode that we get thrown into after a traumatic event is actually prolonged because we're the only ones carrying that experience. And there's a great quote, and I apologize that I don't know who said it, but there's a great quote that talks about how shame is only possible in silence, because fundamentally shame will drive us to hold our tongue. That's just what will happen. And when we are brave enough to speak that out loud into safe environments, we can't be as ashamed of it simply because somebody else knows it and they responded well. So if that's not how it plays out, unfortunately, what happens is that survival mode of just do what you have to do to get through this moment is prolonged. And so we end up seeing really low self-esteem, helplessness. We see mental health challenges, often co-concurring disorders. So you might have some mental health challenges as well as some physical ailments. Basically, your body's way of saying, what I'm carrying is too heavy. I need some help and I need some genuine support.
And I will just add to that, if you back to the graphic of why there's no easy way to create a graphic like this for if you receive a positive response, because when you receive a positive response, it can, because everyone's impacts with trauma are different, what that positive response does for someone is going to serve in different purposes and do different things. But for that, it really opens up, the possibility of trust, of healing, and it's all about empowering an individual, because experiencing sexual violence results in a profound and can result in a profound loss of power and control. And so by empowering them, by believing them and allowing them to make their own decisions about what's next and celebrating, their resilience and their strength and resistance, that is really an amazing way to provide support. And so you don't have to, again, be an expert to do that. It's just about being empathetic, providing a listening ear, and the possibilities of where a survivor will go next after having that positive response, knowing that there's one person out there that believes and supports them, is really powerful as well.
Yeah, beautifully said, Jensen. There's so many opportunities for this to, when it goes well, it can go well in a variety of different directions. And really taking time to understand what that looks like for each person and reminding them or reinforcing their choice in the matter, reinforcing the fact that in this one instance of sexual violence, you might have lost control over choice in that moment. And in fact, that's what happened. And so what's undermined is our ability to make those choices and our confidence to make those choices. So reinforcing for someone, what do you want to do next? And being okay to do that next thing with them reinforces a confidence that they can, in fact, still make decisions for themselves, that they still can have a touch point into who they are and still continue to be.
Thanks for that, Krystal.
Yeah.
So further on the impacts, we've touched a little bit on the justice system, but there's been multitude of research that has come out that the more an individual who's experienced sexual violence conforms to those stereotypes and myths about what we call the ideal victim. And I will just say the ideal victim does not exist, because that's really, again, reinforcing that there is a right way, in fact, to experience sexual violence. And we see this with individuals who, are seemed to have had sound moral characters, don't engage in risky behaviors like going out drinking or dressing a certain way or having multiple partners. They've reported right away through the correct means, and they display the right kind of emotionality. So expressing enough emotion, but not too much. And so the more that an individual can confine and conform to these things, which is highly unlikely because A, none of us are perfect, and B, sexual violence is not the fault of the individual and who they are and what they did or didn't do, and how they did or didn't react before, during, and after. And so we see justice in the sense of those who seek justice through the criminal justice system, through charges being laid and sanctions being brought. We see those as being less likely for generally survivors as a whole, because this construction of an ideal goes beyond the justice system as well and feeds into our greater ideas of what it means to experience sexual violence in the right or the wrong way.
And we've touched on this a bit already, and I talk about it all the time because there's societal attitudes here. We're fighting both an individual conception of what sexual violence means or an experience of sexual violence, but we're also trying to counter the societal wide attitudes that ultimately prevent survivors from disclosing, from sharing their story. There's attitudes that they could have done something to avoid the situation, that survivors are lying about this or trying to get attention, or that there's just not as many cases of sexual violence as we all think there is. And I think if you were to talk to anyone who has lived experience and is willing to share that and their growth story, or anyone who works within the gender-based violence sector, I think you will learn pretty quickly that what sexual violence looks like, it can be very, very different for each and every one of us. And fundamentally, what holds them all together is there is a lack of consent. And so with a lack of consent inherently comes a power dynamic that is unbalanced, and therefore one person did have the disadvantage. And unfortunately, that's often the survivor of the sexual violence. And so challenging ourselves to just really take a step back and see how these attitudes are being held within us somewhere. I work in sexual assault counselor all day, every day, and I still have lots of ways that I need to examine myself and find where are those societal attitudes really residing within me. And I think that's true of everyone, no matter how regularly you have this conversation or how infrequently. We all have a responsibility to help shape what that societal-wide attitude actually is.
And so in terms of other impacts, we see, impacts on policy. And in Ontario in June of last year, we saw this come up quite a bit, where there was a case that could have set precedent for alcohol being potentially used as the defense for sexual violence. And we've seen this come up a few times, of utilizing alcohol to absolve rapists of guilt and to prove, the unreliability of survivors, and utilizing rape myths to disprove the guilt of rapists. So we see this having impacts on policy. We also see this having impacts on policy recently in positive ways, with newly federally appointed judges having to take mandatory sexual assault and anti-racism training, and to be able to provide in their decisions the reasons for sexual assault cases. So that's a way of recognizing just how pervasive these attitudes are, and how they seep into the way that survivors receive accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways that survivors access supports, as Krystal mentioned earlier, for individuals who might have sought support and had a negative experience, that may prevent them from seeking support in the future, or they may be wary about support workers. So that impacts relationships as service providers with survivors as well. And it impacts our personal relationships for those who have disclosed to a friend or a family member or someone close to them, and have experienced what that feels like to have someone directly really close to you believe, not believe, or shame or blame you, can create far-reaching impacts on relationships as well.
Mm-hmm. So what makes for a supportive response? Don't worry, we're getting to the hopeful stuff. So use active listening skills. Legitimately listen to what someone is saying. And when in doubt, try to clarify. Can I repeat back to you what I heard? If you're really unsure, if you're not unsure and you get what someone's saying, to validate that, to repeat back to them what you're hearing, so that they can hear someone else validate them. Applaud them for sharing. Thank them. They've taken possibly one of the bravest steps at combating shame. At their first step of healing is to reach out to someone and share that experience, again, to combat shame. Providing words of affirmation, respecting boundaries. I can't emphasize this one enough. If someone has said that they don't want to talk about it, let it be. It's just don't talk about it. If they say, I'd really like you to help me in this way, try to help them in that way. And remembering that one of the things that was fundamentally questioned by an experience of sexual violence was their boundaries. They said something or they did something to resist what was happening to them, and that wasn't respected. And so rather than perpetuating in small ways that same cycle, we can respect people's boundaries and just reinforce that. Recognize that people are the experts of their own life experience. They're the authors of their own story, and they're the only ones who are walking through their shoes. And so they are the best ones to make the call for what is right for them. And knowing what resources are available in your community. You don't have to be a Rolodex of contacts in your area for what happens if someone experiences sexual violence. Maybe know one or two, a distress line, an organization like Women in Crisis, any other resource, just to know that if someone said, I would like some help, you have something in your toolbox ready to go that you're familiar with on some level, and then you can research together from there. If that's not the appropriate service, maybe reaching out to that service to find out what would meet the need of whoever has disclosed to you, and kind of asking questions and working together to find out what resources are in fact most helpful or supportive for that individual.
And so if you've engaged in secondary wounding, how do you come back from that? How do you want to correct that? And really the best apology is changed behavior, and acknowledging your mistakes. If there is an incident where, and I think this depends too of your reaction and how you move forward, is your relationship to the person who's disclosed to you. Because if it's someone who is close to you, a personal friend, you may have the opportunity to connect with them and acknowledge your mistakes and apologize. If you're a service provider, you may not have that opportunity, but I think you can have that opportunity in the future to be able to recognize and reflect on, your own biases and be able to, in your response going forward, to have those positive, reaffirming responses. And for those who are able to and want to make that apology, recognize that your apology may not be accepted. And that goes along with the difference of intention versus impact. We may not have intended to cause harm. And the harm that is caused is honestly, it's natural to happen because of the way that these negative ideas about survivors are so internalized. But the impact of what that response had on someone may not be repairable. And I think being willing to accept that and continue to reflect on how you can change your behaviors going forward would be my best advice.
Mm-hmm. We did have a question in the chat box I just wanted to address about what happens when one person sees an event or as a situation of sexual assault, but others don't see it that way. How does someone as yourself work with this person? Not a specific case. This is most cases of sexual violence, that there will often be people who don't initially believe, if they found out, they wouldn't necessarily believe that it happened. I know Tom. Tom's a nice guy. He wouldn't do that. In reality, there's two people who know what happened in that event. If one of those people is telling you something went wrong, it doesn't need to matter what everybody else thinks. Perception is often reality. If someone is perceiving that they were violated or that someone did something without consent, then I always take the harm reduction approach of, okay, well, I'm going to believe you until something proves me wrong, because why on earth would you make this up and take the step to tell me about it in detail if it didn't happen? And so I think just kind of reminding yourself of that the individual is the expert of their own experience. And so what everybody else's perceptions of the situation are doesn't have to hold that much weight.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great response. Thanks, Krystal.
Yeah. So takeaways. There is no right or wrong way for someone to respond to a traumatic event. We are put into survival mode. We are put into our most animalistic state when we experience these moments of trauma. And how we respond is biological, physiological, not a lot of choice. It's an automatic response. And so there is no right or wrong way to respond to it. Survivors appreciate someone who listens without judgment, and prioritizes their needs and validates what they're saying and their feelings, and reminds them that they're safe, and tries to create spaces where they are safer. Often one of the things that people report the most after experiencing sexual violence is that the world doesn't feel safe anymore. And so how do you make your home or your kitchen table or your virtual office a little more comfortable so that if someone needed to talk to you, they could, and it would be a safe place that they wouldn't be discredited or wouldn't be judged for what they're saying. And really, you can't underestimate what listening really does. Sometimes we think about sexual violence as this unique experience that takes a whole skill set. And in some ways, it does take a skill set to help someone truly process through those experiences. But we've all showed up for people who were in pain, whether that's because they lost someone they love or went through a hard time, personal life situation. We've all managed to show up for people in those moments. And I think one of the things that people most often appreciate is just the space to say things out loud, to have them be heard. And the simple act of saying things out loud is astronomically beneficial. And there's a lot of really interesting research that talks about how survivors of sexual violence are less likely to deal with prolonged impacts of trauma if they are able to share in a safe space within a 2-week period after the assault. And that's research, that's not everybody's story or everybody's case, but we know that earlier on that we can create those relationships that really do value safety, non-judgment, create spaces where we can be listened to, that can have a really positive impact.
Mm-hmm. And just reaffirming, we've said this a few times, that you don't have to be an expert to be able to support someone. And it's very, very okay to acknowledge what your limitations are in being able to provide that support. Maybe your limitations are that, you don't feel qualified to provide professional counseling, which is totally okay. There are opportunities for, if that's desired, that to be available from organizations in the community. If you can't be your number one support system for someone, that's also okay. And acknowledging, your own boundaries and being able to, what kind of support can you provide? And so that's, I think, important too, when asking questions such as, what do you need to feel supported right now? Or what does safe look like for you? To kind of get an outline too of like, where are the elements where I can provide support? And where are the elements where I can maybe see if there's interest in exploring services in the community? Just reaffirming the powerful role that a supportive response can play, even if that's not saying anything and just listening, and saying like, thank you for trusting me, I really appreciate that you told me what happened, and I will support you no matter what. That's 2 sentences, and I think that there's so much power in those words, and there's power in the negative and the victim blaming and the secondary wounding. But I think going through the impacts of that, and really just those are the things that you just want to avoid, and being mindful of that and processing our own biases, and providing that positive support, and being okay, that we're not going to be able to provide someone with everything they need, and that's okay. To be able to provide, what is the network of support that I can create? that's it from us in terms of us talking, but we would love to hear from you folks if you have any questions that might have come up throughout. We can give you folks a few minutes if you would like to put them in the chat. And for folks who might not feel comfortable asking in the chat, you can also private message them to Krystal or myself by going in the chat, and next to everyone should be an arrow there where you can select either Krystal or myself if you'd like to ask a question confidentially as well.
Someone did put a question in the chat box about what happens with teenagers or minors in instances of sexual violence. And before we get too deep, I will acknowledge the fact that I'm a registered social worker. And so therefore, if I learn that there's a child under the age of 16 who's at risk, I have a duty to report to the College of Social Work. That's not what's going to happen next, though. Don't worry. I just have to tell you that. Minors are a very, you would think it would be more cut and dry than it is. And that's not the reality. It is quite complicated, in fact, because you really do need to balance the relational side of a youth has trusted you to come forward with this information. And oftentimes they don't want their families to find out. They don't want people to treat them differently. They don't want to share that story. The College of Social Workers would tell you that if you are aware that someone if a minor is at risk, then you have a responsibility to inform the parents and inform someone other than yourself so that they can look into it for the protection of that child. I think it's really important for as much as humanly possible for the youth to be the one who tells their parents. And so if that is the thing that is the most terrifying to them, helping them unpack what is it exactly that makes them feel so unsafe to tell their parents, and maybe trying to address some of those issues in advance of just coming straight out and telling someone what happened. Families are complicated systems, and there's so many power dynamics at play, and youth are filled with all kinds of hormones and development stages and all kinds of things. Ultimately, we want to reinforce the same things for adults as we do children. We want them to feel validated, that we believe them. We want them to feel supported. We want to reinforce their sense of choice. Now, if a youth has experienced sexual violence and has a host of coping mechanisms that are less than ideal, indulging in self-harm or risky behaviors, that sort of thing, you really kind of have to triage it depending on where they're at. But I think fundamentally as a guideline, I would say as much as possible, try to reinforce that youth sense of choice and autonomy in the situation, and really work to what could make this safer. Do they just need someone to come with them so that it's not just them telling their parents? Maybe you could go along. Is there, do they need a debrief call right after? There's so many ways to kind of strategize with them about what may or may not be helpful. As community resources, Guelph-Wellington Women in Crisis supports folks, female identifying folks who are over the age of 16. They know that Child Witness, as well as Family Counseling Support Services, offers counseling opportunities for children who've experienced trauma as well.
Right. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat for now, but maybe we'll just go to the next slide to talk about where folks can get in touch with us after today if they would like to reach out to us. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat in the next few minutes. But we want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. We know that many of us are spending most of our days online, so it means a lot that you took the time out of your evening to spend it with us to learn about how to support survivors who come forward. And these skills are really important for everyone to have, service providers, community members, friends and family members, all of us are part of this work. And as part of Sexual Violence Prevention Month, we really want to lead with the fact that all of us have a responsibility in preventing sexual violence, and all of us can play a positive and supportive role for survivors and for the community. So we hope that you found this helpful this evening in taking these skills going forward. If you would like as well, I provide free trainings for workplaces around professional development. If you are looking for this type of training for your workplace, if you're looking for information about workplace sexual harassment, many things all related to domestic sexual violence and human trafficking, you can reach out to me for future trainings and opportunities for education. And you can also reach out to Krystal if you wanted to share your info as well.
Yeah, so if you have any like specific questions that you don't feel comfortable talking about in this group, or just questions on how you can support someone, questions about how sexual violence can impact people, always feel free to reach out. I'm happy to get back to you with what I know, which is a very small piece of the puzzle. But my email address is here. I do my best to return emails within 48 hours, but sometimes that doesn't happen. I will obviously do my best. And I'm happy to share what knowledge I have.
And thank you so much for joining me to share your knowledge tonight, Krystal. I really appreciate it. And folks can always call our 24-hour crisis line as well. You don't have to be in crisis to call. And you also, if you're a friend or family member of someone who is experiencing sexual violence and you're looking for someone to support you, we can also provide support through our 24-hour crisis line. So stay in touch. We thank you so much for coming this evening. And we hope you have a great rest of your night and stay safe. And this will also, as I mentioned, be being recorded. So if you would like the slides or the copy of the recording, you can send me an email. Have a wonderful night, everyone, and thanks so much.